Right off the top, the fate of a mother accused of killing her 3 children is now in the hands of a jury. Those jurors right now beginning deliberations in the trial of Lindsay Clancy in Massachusetts. That mother admits she killed these 3 children you see here on the screen behind me. But Clancy and her attorney say that she should not be held criminally responsible for first-degree murder. You're looking at 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan. They are central to this case. Here's the last thing members of the jury heard before going into deliberations.
She was a nurse, a daughter, a wife, and a darn good mother. Calling another suicide hotline. We can't help you. My God, what does she have to do? She was reaching out for help.
Every doctor she saw, from Tufts in September all the way through Tufts at January 23rd, none of them saw any signs of psychosis ever. So they're all wrong. Cora wanted to be a doctor and a mom. Dawson wanted to be a fighter. Callan never got the chance to dream. Who knows what future he would have dreamed for himself.
Live outside the courthouse is CBS News correspondent Shanelle Kaul. Shanelle, we had a producer in the room during those closing arguments. Do we know anything about how the members of the jury reacted? We saw Lindsay Clancy there wiping tears.
Yeah, it was an emotional moment for so many people inside that courtroom. And I should mention there were over 100 people in line behind me to get in this morning. Obviously, a lot of public interest, a lot of people that have been following this trial very closely wanted to see what was happening inside during this huge moment, during closing arguments. Now those jurors are deliberating. I should note that jury panel was originally made up of 12 women and 6 men. There were 18, including alternates. Now that's been reduced. So there are ultimately only going to be 12 jurors who are inside court beginning those deliberations right now, and we understand that consists of 9 women and 3 men. I'm told that all of the jurors that were inside the courtroom as those closing arguments were being performed were emotional. In fact, 2, I'm told, were seen crying during Kevin Reddington's closing arguments. So a lot of emotion during those closing arguments, because remember, Reed, there was so much graphic evidence in this case. There was so much emotional testimony. And here we are now at the end. Those jurors must make a decision on a verdict for Lindsay Clancy.
So our minds are now with the jury, and they are behind closed doors deliberating her fate. You've been covering this from the beginning. Everything that you have heard, all told, what's going to be the most memorable revelation to those jurors as they start that discussion?
Yeah, and I should note, Reed, that while I just mentioned that emotions may have been high during those closing statements, it's not going to be about the emotion. You heard the judge there talking about how what they have to do now behind closed doors is decide on a verdict based on the evidence and the facts of this case. And we've seen a lot of evidence over the last several weeks, right? There was a tranche of videos, of photos, of diary entries from Lindsay Clancy, of text messages, of Google searches, of phone calls. They're going to have to look at all of that now before they make this decision. I remember very early on in this trial, during the first week, we heard that chilling 911 phone call, right? The phone call that Patrick Clancy made to police the night he came home and he found his wife on the ground in the middle of winter, and then he went down to the basement. He found his 3 young children and discovered what had happened. And I will never forget hearing that moment where he discovered them down there. And it was chilling, and the jurors would have had to hear that too. There was another moment where prosecutors brought the exercise bands that were allegedly used to kill the children. That was also really graphic. But I think the most pivotal moment here, the most pivotal few days of testimony, were about what's at the heart of this case, which is Lindsay Clancy's mental health, her mental condition, the night all of this happened. And what jurors had to hear was pretty opposing testimony, right? We had prosecutors bring their medical experts, and those medical experts argued that during their medical evaluation of Lindsay Clancy, a couple of years, I should note, after the night of the crime, they did not think that she was suffering from postpartum psychosis that night. Then you had a star defense witness, somebody who's testified in many other high-profile trials, Dr. Philip Resnick, who testified for the defense. And he said, Reed, that in his medical evaluation, he thinks Lindsay Clancy was suffering from postpartum psychosis. You might even remember that moment where he testified to jurors that she was sort of like a puppet and someone else was pulling the strings.
So many pivotal testimonies now in the hands of the jury. And Shanelle Kaul, thank you so much for days and days of coverage. We appreciate you. Let's now continue the conversation live to CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. So Katrina, the judge spoke at length prior to those closing arguments. What did he have to say?
Reed, the judge decided to actually begin instructing the jury before the closing arguments happened. So he was giving them more background information on these charges. He also explained to them that if they find that Lindsay Clancy has a mental defect or could not really understand how to conform her conduct to the law, that they can find her potentially not guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity for having postpartum psychosis. He also explained to them that if she is found not guilty by reason of insanity, that doesn't mean that she goes free, Reed. She will be committed to a mental hospital. That is what happened to Andrea Yates, who was also found not guilty by reason of insanity for killing her own children. And then he laid out these charges, all of the elements of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter. There was a notable moment to Reed when he was talking about first-degree murder, which requires intent, premeditation. Lindsay Clancy just broke down crying during that explanation.
Let's talk about the jury a little bit more. And Shanelle alluded to this, but there were 18 jurors in total, but only 12 actually get to go into that room to deliberate. Can you explain that process to our viewers who may not have gotten that far in jury duty?
So they chose 18 jurors to begin with, and a big part of that, Reed, is so that they have alternates in case something comes up with a juror. Maybe there's something that happens in their family, they have a health issue. They want to make sure that ultimately they have at least 12 jurors who have heard everything in this trial and can end up in that deliberation room. So what they did here in Massachusetts was they let them know right before they deliberate who are going to be the alternates. And we have some sound. Let's take a listen to what the judge told the jury.
When we impanel a jury at the beginning of a trial, we never know whether some personal emergency will arise or during the course of the trial, which would require one or more of the jurors to be excused from further jury duty. To avoid having to start the trial all over again, if that should occur, we impaneled, in this case, 18 jurors, even though the case will be eventually decided by 12 of you. And we made that decision because this is a lengthy case over the summer. The time has now come to reduce that number. This is especially difficult in this case, where all 18 of you have been equally dedicated and attentive to this case during the course of this trial, but the case is to be decided by 12, all right? And so the way it's done is the clerk will draw the alternates' names. We put all the numbers, the exclusion of the foreperson, and then we'll draw out the names randomly for the alternates.
So we know that this jury pool began with 12 women and 6 men. After they reduced the jury, ultimately 9 women and 3 men are going into that deliberation room. But the judge also told these alternates that they should do their own little deliberation process too, because you never know what's going to happen as this goes on. And so they want to make sure that ultimately everyone is ready to make a decision about the outcome of this trial.
All right, Katrina Kaufman, thank you so much. Let's continue talking about this live to CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe. Rebecca, good to have you with us. What's your take on what you heard during those closing arguments?
Well, there are two very, very different narratives, and the lawyers are hoping that the jury will listen to their words and that will resonate with them. So you have the prosecution telling this story of a woman who maybe have suffered some level of depression, sought and received medical aid for that, and then nonetheless ultimately made the decision and chose to kill her children and to attempt to kill herself. The defense, on the other hand, is telling a very different story about a woman who sought help, did not receive the kind of help that she was trying to get, and progressively got worse and worse until at the moment that this incident happened, she was in the grips of this psychosis and could not control her conduct, could not understand the difference between right and wrong. And so, you know, it's all of this testimony that we've heard over this long period of time that's now woven into two separate narratives that the lawyers are hoping that the jury will resonate with the jury and the jury will ultimately adopt.
Dueling narratives at that, and both really rooted in medical opinion, a medical opinion as it speaks to mental wellness and mental health. What can we expect from the jury? So if our viewers, if we break in and say, listen, the jury asked for maybe more medical records, how does that sort of inform us to what they're thinking on the inside of that deliberation room?
Yes, so the jury has a number of different possibilities. One is to determine that she's guilty, guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. And then finally, what the defense attorney has been presenting is this case of not guilty by reason of insanity. I think if they're looking at medical records, they're really thinking about that charge. They're thinking of whether or not they should hold that she's not guilty by reason of insanity. If they're looking more at, questioning facts, perhaps maybe they're thinking of, whether they should do, charge for manslaughter or first-degree murder or second-degree murder. I mean, these are hints, and you never know for sure, but that's one possibility.
All right, so there are two possibilities as far as what will happen to Lindsay Clancy after that verdict comes in. What are those outcomes?
So if she's found guilty of first-degree murder or second-degree murder, she likely will spend the rest of her life, or at least will get a sentence of life without parole in prison. If she's convicted of manslaughter, interestingly, the sentence is up to 20 years in prison. That leaves a lot of discretion to the sentencing judge to determine what would be an appropriate sentence. If the jury determines that she's not guilty by reason of insanity, as you mentioned before, that does not mean that she goes free. That means that she enters the civil commitment process, and the question ultimately becomes, is she a danger to herself and to others? There is no doubt after these murders that for some substantial time, a court will determine with the help of medical professionals that she is not, it is not safe for her to be out, and she will be in a mental facility. But ultimately, there will be periodic check-ins in which there will be a determination repeatedly. It is not a punishment, but it is a protection, a civil protection against dangerousness.
All right, so for our viewers who are just now logging on or tuning in, jury deliberations have begun in the Lindsay Clancy trial as we await maybe messages from that jury. We thank our experts, Rebecca among them, for joining us today. We'll continue watching what happens out of Massachusetts.